discussion is a very rare opportunity to hear two preeminent, world-renowned early music string players in conversation with each other, and this is really an honor in and of itself. But do stay for the concert. We have Mary Matthews. Baroque violinist extraordinaire, and we have here Sarah Mead, music director of Nota Bene, and violin player extraordinaire. All right, take it away.
Thank you so much. Well, I'll just jump in and welcome, since I live in Bloomington, I will welcome Sarah and Nota Bene. It's so wonderful to have you here. It's really such a treat for all of us. And this is going to be such an interesting concert. I have already read the program notes. I don't know if you have all read them, but it's truly such a fascinating concept. Continental Drift is the title of the program, referring to music that started one place and was found north, south, east, and west, far, far away. And to read the notes is really, it's a dizzying array of stories. And so first of all, Sarah, I thought I'd ask you how you came up with this concept, and also a little bit about the process of pulling the pieces together, finding things that would fit the bill.
Well, it began, the thought about it, I've been thinking about the question of how one piece showed up somewhere else for a long time, but what really set it off was a couple of years ago when Nota Bene were invited to play on a Josquin festival that was taking place in the UK, but it was during the pandemic, so we could stay put and play our Josquin program from this side of the ocean. And I also had to give a talk for that festival. So in the process of doing the research for it, I realized that there were, of course, Josquin's pieces had traveled all over the European continent, but that there were a few instances of Josquin pieces showing up in the British Isles. And I was very curious how that happened, because you didn't just take them in your saddlebag from the northern France and show up in England. So some of the instances were, well, one was a beautiful choir book that was copied in the studio of Pietro Salamire for King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And that had two pieces by Josquin in it. And then later, when Henry had someone else to marry, Anne Boleyn showed up from France with a book of music for which you can buy a really cool facsimile, which had pieces of Josquin in it that she had brought from the continent. And over time I found out that there were some wealthy nobles in 16th century England who were great book collectors, and some of them had some of the earliest printed books printed by Ottaviano Petrucci at the beginning of the 16th century that included pieces by Josquin. Some of those pieces then showed up in hand copies in churches in England with another part added by an English composer, which changed the whole flavor of the pieces, and that seemed quite fascinating. Then finally, I read an article about a painting of four children from a noble family in England from the middle of the 16th century. They're singing from music, and somebody only recently took the trouble of trying to figure out what they're looking at. And they realized that it's an exact copy of a page of one of these Petrucci books, which would have come to England at least 50 years before that. That was all very interesting. What did these English people know about this Flemish composer from 2 generations before that? That got me thinking. There were a set of books at Brandeis University where I teach, which fascinated me because they were from the north, they were from Germany, but in the front of them was a piece by Morales. And it was clear that they had used the morales to make the rest of the pieces look important. So it was the first one in the book. You know, why morales? How did a Spanish composer who worked in Italy end up in this German book? So that was another one. Then I recalled a friend of mine and colleague of all of us, Yukimi Kambe, who directs the foremost Japanese viola da gamba consort, that had done research on the Portuguese bringing viol music to Japan, and it all began to fall in place, and I began to wonder what other combinations, how else music might have come from one distinct civilization and ended up in quite a different place during the 16th century.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, and you're certainly bringing us a really great selection of different stories of this nature. You mentioned the one piece of Josquin that made its way to Britain and had another part added.
Yes.
I think that's really, I love that a piece might travel, you know, across the globe and then sort of change when it got there or be influenced in one way or another. Do we know of other instances of that happening, a piece kind of morphing as it traveled?
It probably happened a great deal more than we know, because a lot of those changes wouldn't have been written down. Pieces that traveled somewhere and became part of a local repertoire probably took on very different characters from where they had originally started. But some examples that we're very lucky to have, we're actually fortunate, you're fortunate to have right here in the library at IU, and were figured out by your very own Paul Borg when he was working on his dissertation in the mid-'80s. Is that about right? Yeah. And he found that this particular manuscript, number 8 of the collection of the Guatemalan manuscripts from San Juan Ixcoy, these pieces that appeared to be in local indigenous hand looked familiar. And he began to piece together where they had originally come from. And they were, many of them, were chansons and Italian madrigals from the earlier part of the 16th century, which had somehow found their way across the Atlantic Ocean to a very small town in Guatemala and been copied into their books without really understanding the language. So the titles are kind of fantastical. And not only that, but they must have seen, the original examples must have had illuminated letters because they had their own local version of them with sort of local faces in them that looked nothing like the European illuminated letters, but looked quite marvelous. And Paul was able to provide us with a lot of insights into those books and help us to find pieces that we could then trace back to French and Italian sources. And what we found is that in a lot of cases, the people copying them had changed them somewhat. And often what they had changed was the opening rhythms. They actually simplified a lot of the opening rhythms as though it was more straightforward for the indigenous players to all start together rather than overlap as much. And they had certain ornaments that they added which seemed to have been their favorite ones because we hear them over and over and over again written into the music. But what fascinates me the most about these books is that the missionaries who brought the music and taught the indigenous people to sing and play it were chased out. They weren't there for very long, but the books remained. And they remained part of the culture of the people in that village and would be brought out every year at festival times and marched around the town. Who knows what those pieces sounded like 200 years later when they continued to come out for special occasions? That blew me away, that idea.
Yeah, it's wonderful to think of these cultural influences, even if they're sort of most obviously going in one direction, they're always kind of a two-way street. So you are bringing out tonight some examples of pieces that made it to Japan and Angola. Particularly in those two places, I did want to ask you, speaking of indigenous players, who exactly played that music? How were they trained? And yes, I was going to ask, you've maybe already spoken to this, but if there's any way of knowing how they influenced the music in turn.
It's a really good question, and I think there's still a great deal to be learned about that. The Japanese players were trained as young boys by missionaries who came from Portugal and set up small schools for boys in Japan where they were taught to sing and using viols as a way to help them learn to sing. Because there is an advantage to having frets. And they can, if you are not used to singing a scale that has half steps in it, it helps to have them already there for you. And they were trained by using the same system of reading music, the Guidonian hand and the system of the gamut to play and to sing. What's particularly interesting about the Japanese players is that some of them became so skilled that eventually a group of these boys, now grown, were brought back to Europe. They were brought to Venice, where they played for the Venetian people and got to hear Gabriele and a number of other composers right there in Venice before they went back to Japan. Soon after that, the shogun kicked all such people out of Japan. Doors were closed, instruments were destroyed, all the music was either shipped away to Indonesia or was lost or burned. So it was a very short time of maybe 35 to 40 years that this European music had a home in Japan. But during that time, there are actually a lot of pictures of paintings of Japanese people playing viola da gamba. For Angola, they trained the local singers, probably also with children, but the singing of the Morales piece, one of which we're doing the Missa Cortilla, which just means the really short mass, good choice for taking a piece to a new country and a completely different culture. It's made up of just a snippet of the notes of the gamut. What is it? Fa, re, ud, re, what is it? Fa, da, di, da, da, fa, re, ud, fa, sol, la. All the parts do fa, re, ud, fa, sol, la, all through it. They get it to do it a couple times and it's over. It's a really short mass. You could imagine that they had been taught to sing these notes. What I don't know is how the children being taught to do that in Angola by Portuguese people who had come to their place of living, what they thought of it and how they compared those sounds to the sounds they were accustomed to hearing from their families and their villages, and how they explained the Guidonian hand and the gamut to their parents, what they were being taught to do. I would love to know more about how that was done, but apparently they did sing this entire mass within 3 years of the Portuguese settling in this city and building a church. They worked fast.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about viol playing around the world, not just singing, but what other parts of the world? We know obviously that viol playing was huge in Europe, but can you talk about around the world?
Well, we know that they took viols to Japan, actual viols from Europe. They took viols to West Africa, but more than that, I love the fact that Sir Francis Drake took a consort of viol players on all of his expeditions. So when he boarded the Golden Hind to go around the world in, 1579, he had a consort of viols. And all we can ever think is, oh, the tuning must have been different. And also, So once those strings start to break, when you go ashore and look for something that looks like a sheep, and we know that there are descriptions of the musicians that Sir Francis Drake had playing for dinner parties when other captains visited his ship and things like that, but also that they would be sent ashore first in a place where it wasn't clear how the local people would feel about it.
The red shirts.
The thought being that once the local people heard the music, they would say, "Oh, they're nice." We know that one of these ships landed not far from one of our members where she lives now. She wasn't there at the time. But Julie Jeffrey lives in the Oakland, Richmond area and in California, and we know that Sir Francis Drake sent a group of viol players ashore. I imagine them looking for the right height of rock to sit on so they could play, and that people came out of the woods and they wrote down what the people said. They said, "Gnaw, gnaw." And Drake took that to mean, "That's wonderful." But we don't actually know what they meant by it. They might have said, "That's so out of tune." I don't know.
That's amazing. It's amazing. Well, let's move from viol playing around the world to the specific viols, because I think it's kind of an interesting collection of specific instruments you have on stage tonight. Could you tell us a bit about that?
We're lucky to have a set of instruments that were all built by the same builder. Help me, it suddenly left my head.
Rayners?
Yes, Rayners, yes. Rayners is a Canadian music historian and luthier and a lute player. And he got a grant from the Canadian Arts Council back in, I was about to say the 1580s, but it was the 1980s, to go to Europe and study instruments that were in museums there, surviving instruments from the 16th century. Up to that point, the instruments that were being copied, the viols that everybody played, were copies of 17th century instruments, more of a Baroque style of instrument. But he was really interested in what was happening before that. So he measured and photographed and got lots of information about museum instruments there, and then came back and cataloged all that and tried making a variety of different kinds of instruments based on his measurements. And the ones that he liked the best and found that were most successful for him were copies of a set of instruments that survived from shops in Brescia. Basically the same street that the Stradivari family ended up building on. It was just, that's where all the string instruments were being built. And so he copied, using that model, he made a set of instruments of different sizes, which are really reproductions of what would have been being made in northern Italy in the 1580s, which is perfect for us because we like to play music from that part of the 16th century. The only thing he didn't build was a treble, and our treble, which is modeled on a similar instrument, was built by actually a Brazilian builder who works in Italy now.
Well, it must be a wonderful feeling to play in an ensemble with instruments that are so well matched. Not only players that are so well matched in terms of your aesthetic values, but also the instruments themselves.
Well, part of what makes it so good is that these instruments didn't ever live together. They went out across Canada and the U.S. to various homes.
Continental drift, sort of.
Exactly. And we collected them and introduced them to each other and gave them a chance to play together for the first time since they were built, which has been a real pleasure for Ray as well, to be able to hear.
Yeah, well, what a treat for us. Would you like to tell us a little bit about Nota Bene, how long you've been together, how you decided on the name?
Well, the deciding on the name is a little woo-woo, actually. And anybody knows me knows that is not my style, but I woke up one morning, this really happened, about 13 years ago, and I said, Nota Bene. That's a perfect name for a group. I gotta start a group. And I know who I want to start it with. And I started by calling Wendy and saying, shall we start a group? And Wendy said, yes, and let's do Renaissance viols. Do you think we can find some Renaissance viols? And from there, we called other people who we really enjoyed playing with, which is why it's really fun to play together, but also difficult because they're from all over the country. We don't all live in the same place. So we get to have a project, and we come together to do the project. Fortunately, we've quite a few times been at Avaloq Music, Summer Music, what's it called? Anyway, it's a place. It's a place where chamber groups can go and work together and do nothing but that. And that's given us a chance to work exclusively with each other and with these instruments and learn what the instruments can tell us. They had a lot to say. The bows are also quite different from 17th century bows. They're a little bit like telephone poles with hair on them, and they have a very different way of responding, but over time we came to really love the way they did respond. They're all built by Kuhn Engelhardt in France, and he has a real passion for bows that are copies of 16th century ones.
Well, Sarah, I'm really struck by, well, I'll start this way. People often say that the internet has made the world smaller, and globalization and has kind of made us aware of the whole world in a new way, and I'm sure that's true, but I just think it's wonderful that you're celebrating tonight that not only the music that traversed the world, the instruments that have come together from all these places, the players, yourselves, coming together for this concert. It just kind of reminds me how I think there's sort of a human drive. I think it's part of human nature to kind of want to bring the world together, and especially in pursuit of making beauty to put out into the world. So I'm really excited to hear the concert tonight, and I'm not sure what time it is. We might have time for a few questions, if there are any.
Yes?
For Sarah?
We have time for 2 questions.
Okay, 2
Perfect.
questions.
There's one right there.
Hello. Thank you. I was struck by your comment about the strings earlier, and so now I want to know what's different about the strings you use on these instruments versus any natural strings used on contemporary.
Well, one of the things that would be different is that all of the strings, no matter how thick the diameter, how deep the note, are all made purely from gut. And nowadays, a lot of the thicker strings are made less bulky by having a gut core wrapped in metal. But in the 16th century, they didn't have the means of winding strings with wire. So we have to play, in order to learn from these instruments, we have to play on the kind of strings that they would have used. And some of them are really big. They require a different kind of articulation and attack, which the different bow grip and the different kind of bow actually seems, it makes sense, works very well for, but it does require a different kind of approach. Pardon?
Is it more work?
It's more ping. Actually, it sort of takes you back to the origins of these instruments as plucked instruments before you get to hear a more plucked attack from the bow. Yeah. Is that valid? One other question? Anyone? I've said it all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us for the pre-concert talk.